d'Ivoire. Our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts. portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Benin Cashew que ne permet pas le développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager les informations avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière Cashew au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cashew.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou, dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité, que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières, des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillé par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production,
Africa. A continent thriving with
Mea was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. Mea is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. Mea is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Mea brand new cashew color sorter equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro color difference, mold and spores which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Mea is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway following the same approach: cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Je m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaku. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé à collaborer avec le projet Benekadjo. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadjo, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'Anakadi, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce qu'il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benekadjo nous a aidés. Parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'Anakadi. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site modèle. Nous souhaitons que Benekadjo continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Benekadjo nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Benekadjo pour ses apports à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
En relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites conçus qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacarde.
En termes d'action, TechnoServe à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences l'axe qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savé et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, TechnoServe a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
TechnoServe nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew TechnoServe a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec TechnoServe est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de TechnoServe, identifié des arbres élites performants d'anacardier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec TechnoServe le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie, le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre cajou.
Le rôle du pépiniériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépiniériste, le matériel végétal performant vont disparaître. Ce que Bénin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Bénin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Benin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
Recording in progress.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. On behalf of the African Cashew Alliance, I extend our sincere gratitude to everyone who joined us at the 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in Saly, Senegal. We are grateful that your continuous support has made it possible for us to continually bring you the largest cashew conference in Africa. Now back to the Global Market Encounter. Please note that this session is being held in English with the interpretation. To access this service, please locate the globe icon on your screen. Select a preferred language and mute the original sound. Should you have any question or need for clarification as the presentation is ongoing, do share with us using the Q&A feature and we'll address after the presentation. Without taking much time, join you welcome Jim. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. How are you?
I'm doing well, Jim, and you?
Yeah, all good, thanks. Enjoyed the conference. Back to business. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, wherever you are. Today we're going to update the market, have a look at some of the developments over the past 3-4 weeks, and we're also going to ask the question, is this a turning point in the market? And that question is prompted by a number of factors that have become clear in the second half of September and into the early days of October. So we have seen the market get a little bit firmer. Prices have moved up a little bit. And that appears to be based on improving demand in all markets. The big markets, India, the US, Europe, and China. And we're seeing the export figures, particularly from Vietnam, and we're talking cashew kernels here. We've seen record figures in Vietnam for exports in the month of August. And we see US imports improving. And US was the market that was lagging a little bit in the first half of the year. And that's led to a wider price range. So we've seen in Vietnam the gap from the lower end of the prices to the higher end, that's widened out. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that means and how that happens. So let's have a look at some of the figures. Let's have a look at some of the influences that might make us think that the market is a little bit firmer. So we'll start by taking a look at the situation in Vietnam, and we look at exports from Vietnam. So what we're seeing is that the monthly exports from Vietnam are breaking records. The August figure was the highest month of exports from Vietnam ever, the highest single month of exports ever. And if we look at the figures, we can see that in fact each of the last 4 months have been record months. Very positive factor. And looking at it, we see that in 2023, exports are matching any previous period. And comparing it way back to 2019, we see a huge increase in exports. So this is very positive news from a demand point of view. let's look at the other side of the coin and we look at the US market. And I'm picking the US market, as I said, because it has lagged a little bit behind in terms of its import performance in 2023 so far. But that appears to be changing. US July imports were up 25% on July of 2022, and this is the best July ever, excluding 2021, which was something of an unusual year, as we all know. So if we look at July 2023, we can see that it's just above 2019 and way above any other year in history. Again, this looks quite positive. If we try and predict that forward a little bit and ask the question, will this continue? The first thing we can do is look at shipments from origin. So goods that have already been shipped from Vietnam especially. Vietnam has about 86% share of the US market in 2023. But if we look at shipments from Vietnam and just predict forward where the imports in the US will be, it looks like that we could be back in line with 2022 by October. Now that's very good going, because earlier this year, some months were 17, 19, even 24% below the same month in 2022. So it does look like there is something of a recovery. It does look like the US imports are improving. Perhaps the problem of the inventories brought in the early part of 2022 is solved. Perhaps retailers are getting back to promoting cashews, and maybe consumers are again seeing nuts and cashews in particular as a more affordable option. So there is a good chance that the 2023 figure will match the 2022 figure, and an outside chance that the US will import more this year than it did last year. That's positive news. That might explain why the market's getting firmer. And good news for African processors too. Africa's market share in the US is growing. So far this year, January to July, that's the latest figure we have from the US, African processors have about a 7% share. 5,744 tons imported, and that will probably increase because generally speaking, imports from African countries are stronger in the second half of the year than in the first half. And if we look at the longer term history, this time we're going to look at it based on percentage market share. So that will take into account ups and downs in demand and imports in the US, which have been volatile in recent years. But if we look at the situation, we're now looking at a genuine increase in market share. Back 2013, 2014, the US market was much smaller then, of course. African processors had more than 6%. That fell away during the growth of the US market. It fell away significantly during COVID, but it does appear to be recovering. And Côte d'Ivoire dominates. 72% of African imports to the United States in January, July 2023 were from Côte d'Ivoire. Unfortunately, Nigerian trade on cashew kernels with the US this year is significantly down. Now that may recover in the second half of the year, but for now at least, by the end of July, imports were down by 61%. Disappointing. Let's see if that gets corrected in the second half of the year. There may be many reasons behind that. And let's focus in then on the market leader. Côte d'Ivoire certainly leads the way. In 2022, Côte d'Ivoire was number 3 in the world, behind India, but ahead of Brazil, and even exporting more than the rest of Africa combined. If we look at exports in 2022, this includes Burma kernels. What we see quite a turnaround. Just 3-4 years ago, 80% of the export was Burma kernels going to Vietnam for further processing. But now we're seeing that the European Union is the leading destination for Ivorian exports, with other markets close behind, but all present. The USA is present, North Africa and the Middle East, even China and Canada. So we're seeing certain developments, very positive for the export trade in kernels. Now, I know recently that there's been these claims of Côte d'Ivoire is the second exporter in the world, but let's get real. 1 month in 1 year is not a trend. It's just a manipulation of data to make a headline. So let's get real. We don't want to do ourselves damage by making unrealistic claims. So third in the world, huge progress. EU, the leading market for Côte d'Ivoire. Now, this surge in demand, it's been suggested to me recently that this is just seasonal. But I want to say this is a misinterpretation of the way the market works. This recent surge in demand is not just seasonal, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, August, and those are the figures we're dealing with, has only been the highest export month in 1 of 5 years. So when we look at this and when we talk about seasonal demand, is there any history of August being a major month? And looking at the red bars on the chart, you can see that really there isn't. So there's no history of a seasonal buying surge in August. If we look at peak packing demand in Western markets, and this is really what we're talking about, bear in mind, we're talking around about 40% of world demand between Europe and the United States, Canada, Mexico. The peak packing period in those markets is August to November. Forward buying means that the product that's being used and packed now was bought long ago. Months, in some cases, up to a year ago. So this is not just seasonal demand. Some people misinterpret this recent spike in buying as buying for the so-called festival season in the West. That's not correct. This market trades forward. This market will have bought that product a long time ago. So what is going on? Well, there could be a number of things happening with this buying. It could be that importers are covering some short positions, or that they're building positions for forward. It could be that there is some seasonal top-ups to replace inventory, and I think that's probably true. There probably are some top-ups where the usage of the product has been a little bit more than was anticipated. And it could be, and I think this is probably the real factor in play, it could be that forward buying has started to kick in, and that means for January forward, to take advantage of the low prices that we're seeing. Now, one of the symptoms of a market that's moving is that the price range widens. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when we look at prices in any origin, so when we look in West Africa, in Vietnam, in India, we can see that there's a variety of prices. There's prices in Vietnam today range from around about $2.40. We're talking WW320s FOB as usual, right up to maybe as high as $2.60. And that depends on a number of factors. It depends on the quality of the product. So that's one of the reasons why African 320s are a premium to Vietnamese 320s right now. It depends on the location. Again, in favor of African 320s. It depends on the costs to bring it to the market. So freight and other costs that might impact the value of the product in the destination market. It reflects the risk. So this would be partially in the Vietnamese situation. The risk of default, for example, it would also apply in any country, but the risk of default means that certain processors can expect to be offered lower prices than others. And there are all kinds of risk. Contract risk, quality risk, risk in certification, country risk, all different kinds of risk, and that is expressed in prices. The final thing is taxes and market protection. So if you want to sell to a market that has high import taxes, you might expect that the buyers there would look to buy at a lower price. So the gap between the lowest price and the highest price reflects these factors. Now, that gap has widened since August in Vietnam. So whereas the bottom end of the range hasn't really changed, maybe it's moved up a couple of cents, the top end has tended to move up. So that tends to reflect the idea that buyers are prepared to pay a higher price for forward shipment. And if it's a forward shipment, it means there's a greater risk because the longer time between making the contract and getting the shipment, the greater the risk. If the buyers are prepared to pay a higher price for forward shipment or for better quality, it means that they are more concerned that prices will rise. So when we see this gap widen, it can sometimes be an indication that the market is about to move upwards. Now, I say upwards in this case because we are at very low prices. We're at prices that we have not seen since February 2009. So that would tend to make me think that a widening of this gap is an indication that prices will rise or could rise. Let's have a look a little bit more into this, and let's start to try and think about what we sometimes call the market sentiment. So let's think like a trader for a few minutes. So right now, October shipment 320s in Vietnam are available at $2.40. Forward shipments, if you want to buy from someone who will certainly ship and will offer you good quality, you're probably looking at $2.55, maybe $2.60 today. So different kinds of processors, risk of default, and an unstable cashew market create this gap. The trader thinks about it and he says, wait a minute, I have contract purchases at low prices. Those are for shipment October, November, December, maybe further than that. The exporters now offering at the lower prices are less reliable. Why are they less reliable? Well, they're the guys who didn't sell it forward. Maybe they're the guys who couldn't sell forward. Why couldn't they sell forward? Because people thought they were too risky. So you often see this in the prompt market, not just in Vietnam, but everywhere, that people stuck with stock on the spot, short of cash, they're often the ones where there's a greater risk for the buyer. The exporter has a choice. He can bring the stock into his destination market and carry it in the warehouse. But few want to do that, and particularly with the rising cost of money. So the trader says, if the market goes up, my contracts may be defaulted. My existing contracts may be defaulted. That could be a big problem. And it could be worse, because last year, a lot of importers and traders asked their suppliers to delay shipments when demand slowed down. So from July onwards, it's quite common, importers and traders ask, can we delay our shipments? Our buyers don't want the product. And the supplier is saying, that puts me in a difficult position, but what can I do? The market price has fallen. Let me figure out how I'm going to manage through this. Now the trader looks at the forward position. So he knows that later positions are likely to be in more demand. Why? Because people haven't covered later positions in the way that they're covered for October, November, December. Some traders may already have sold and need to buy in. So the trader concludes, I must buy from reliable shippers for forward simply because there's a certain amount of risk and they want a higher price, so I've got to pay it. So this broadens the gap. So the gap between the forward and the nearby starts to broaden. And a trader might think, this is a typical old-fashioned trader, he might think, I'll buy the forward position and I'll leave the nearby positions. That protects the contracts I've already bought because they can't be resold at higher prices. And later, When I need them, I'll come back and I'll start to buy up the lower priced lots nearby. Maybe when I'm sure that the market is starting to go up. So a trader might think like that, and then they might hope that other people would start to think the same way. This gap will widen, and eventually the entire market starts to move up. So let's ask this question. Is this an upturn in the kernels market? Well, let's have a look at the situation. What have we got? What are we looking at? Well, first of all, we're looking at the lowest prices since February 2009. That's an indicator. Secondly, the big impediment to increased demand has been the increase in prices at retail level in Western markets. So we're beginning to see now some retailers are reducing their prices, becoming more competitive, taking advantage of the lower raw material prices to reduce consumer prices, and that could bring consumers back in buying cashew nuts again. Indian demand is critical. Indian demand, most people say, is good. Some people say it's very good. So 3 indicators that this market might be on the turn. But good crops are forecast in other tree nuts, and there are carry-in stocks in those, things like almonds and walnuts. Less so perhaps in hazelnuts, but then again, hazelnuts isn't really directly competing with cashew nuts. Looking at almonds, looking at pistachio, looking at walnuts, there are good crops forecast around the world, and there is a carry-in. So that's going to act as a damper on prices on those nuts in the coming months. And that has 2 effects. First of all, it gives buyers an alternative. And secondly, it keeps the market sentiment neutral. Because people are saying, well, okay, maybe cashews are rising a little, but the almonds aren't, the pistachio aren't. Similar factor, economies. Inflation is proving to be stubborn in US, in Europe, and we're looking at a situation now in China where perhaps there's further signs of economic trouble, symptom of which is the condition of the huge property company Evergrande. So there's reasons on both sides. Some of these factors indicate that, yeah, this is an upturn in the kernels market, but others make us more cautious. However, notice that the factors that make us more cautious are not directly related to the cashew market as such. They're more general economic conditions and other tree nuts. What about the long term? We're saying that demand is good, maybe not great, but still improving. What about the long term? Well, just to give us an indication of the long term, I saw this article on CNN, the US international news channel, and it really gives us a good idea of what's driving demand for nuts in the longer term. So this article appeared on the 3rd of October, written by Carolyn O'Neill, under the headline, Why It's Nutty Not to Eat Nuts for Great Health. And health is a huge driver everywhere in the consumption of nuts. So Carolyn O'Neill is a food professional writing for CNN. And she writes, nuts get rave reviews from nutritionists like me because of their healthy fat profile. Sounds like good news? It is good news. But she also writes about cashews. So whereas almonds, walnuts, pistachio can all use, even macadamia, can use FDA health claims, Food and Drug Administration of the United States, by the way, but cashews have not been approved within that health claim. Even though studies have shown that not only are cashews good in nutritional terms, in health terms, but they actually have been shown to reduce levels of LDL cholesterol. And that's the big enemy in terms of health and the damage done by fats to the human body. So we need action. Somewhere we need action to try and move cashews away from this image of high saturated fat to the truth, which is the result of these studies. If that happens, or when that happens, it could prove a huge boost to demand in cashew nuts. And if you were with us the last time, you'll realize that right now we're looking at a surplus and we need to work on demand to boost consumption of cashew nuts in the coming years. So really interesting in two areas. One, that CNN picks up on nuts. Two, that CNN picks up on cashew nuts. And that Carolyn O'Neill in this article actually points out what we need to do as a sector to improve the profile of cashew nuts worldwide. So long-term demand looks good, and it looks good for the kind of reasons that you see on the screen. Is this an upturn in the kernels market? Is this what we've been waiting for, which is a turnaround in prices? So let's have a look at supply and demand. Let's have a look at the balance, and let's have a look at the risk factors for the upcoming crops. We'll start with RCN, and we'll just do a quick round the world look at the raw cashew nut situation and supply. Starting in Vietnam, imports of raw cashew nuts are at record levels. Record for the first 8 months of the year. We're looking at a high level of inventory in the country. We've seen some really big numbers quoted in some publications this week. I don't agree with them. I'll tell you why in a few minutes. But we are looking at a situation where Vietnam has imported way more than any other year this year. In India, the second biggest processor, the largest consumer, don't forget, imports are down on last year's record, down by about 21%. Now, last year was a remarkable import figure, almost 1.42 million tons. And that figure meant that there was a carry into this year. So India probably needs some more cashew nuts. It looks like demand is good. So we'll probably see a normal carry out of this season. But how much more is needed by India over the next 3 months to meet their demand? East Africa, crops just starting. I think you're looking at 370 to 400,000 tons of crops. Looks pretty good. Forecasts positive. In West Africa, reasonably well sold, I think, for the time of year. Better than some years. Probably still some balances in Guinea-Bissau. And we can account for almost everything in Cote d'Ivoire except about 150,000 tons, which might be stock, might be afloat, might be additional processing. Time will tell. And in Brazil, we've seen a crop forecast, and it looks a little bit lower than last year. It looks significantly lower than last year, but last year was an unusually good crop in the modern era. So overall, a relatively balanced situation. It seems that the stocks left in Africa are going to be lower than might have been expected, but that doesn't mean they've been used. It may mean that they've just been transferred to Vietnam or to India. Let's have a look at those situations. So as I said, we've seen some really high numbers quoted for the stock balance in Vietnam. One publication mentioned 800,000 tons. I'm not sure how they get there. So I had a look to see how that would calculate. So looking at the situation, this is what we get. So the blue bars are 2022 and the grey 2023 up to the 15th of September for imports, but for everything else we've just forecast forward. So when we look at the situation, we see that about 2.2 million tons of imports, a crop around 310,000 tons, could be 320, could be 300. Either way, it's not a huge difference. There is an import of kernels, and the export about 1.9, almost 2 million tons. And I'll explain how I get to that figure in a moment. That would leave a carry-out right now of 540-odd thousand tons. That's about 2.25 months processing. It's not 800,000 tons. It's quite a lot though. And it is more than would have been in Vietnam this time last year. So if we look at the numbers, we need to be really careful. So first of all, we need to use a realistic outturn figure. So I've used 22% outturn. So we shouldn't use cutting test outturns when we talk about processing. Even if the cutting test says 26%, you're going to get some process losses. So I've used 22% on average. And bear in mind, Vietnamese, Cambodian RCN, really high quality, high outturn. But as the season has gone on, we've moved into some of the lower outturn materials. Also, don't forget Vietnam exports processed cashew kernels as well as natural raw cashew kernels. Get back to that in a minute. Vietnam also consumes some kernels, not a huge amount, but it does consume some kernels. Now, in these figures, what's not included is what might be in transit. So we get estimates of what's in transit, but we don't know for sure. What we do know is what's been imported. And if we take what's been imported, what's been exported, this is the kind of number that we end up with, about 2.25 months processing. Not ideal, but at this time of year, not a crisis either. Let's have a look at one of the factors. So Vietnamese exports of processed cashew nuts. What do I mean by processed cashew nuts? I mean cashew nuts that perhaps are roasted, consumer packed, ready for packing at destination, or even ready for retail at destination. And there are exports, particularly to the United States, but also to other markets, Australia, for example, China we know about. But in the case of China, they're probably included in the general export numbers. So you've got to look under different tariff headings. And under this tariff heading, 200-81910, we find cashews. So I looked at US imports, because those were the numbers available. And you can see there's a very strong trend. The blue bars are US imports of processed cashew nuts, which primarily come from Vietnam, as you can see, the red bars. So in 2023, so far, the United States has imported 17,000 tons of processed cashew nuts. That's almost an additional 100,000 tons of RCN. And if we look at Vietnam in the export of all processed tree nuts, I look at all processed tree nuts because I don't have the figures from Vietnam to the 8-digit HS code. But you can also see that up to 2021, the latest figures I have, that the export of processed cashew nuts was going up. So we can no longer ignore the export of processed nuts, and that affects the balance that we see in our balance sheet that I just showed you. So is this 2.25 months stock too much? Well, let's have a look at the situation in previous years. So first of all, we look at the imports. So we know that monthly imports fall toward the end of the year. We know that after West African stocks are bought and shipped, the next shipments are from Tanzania. Maybe they come in November if the auction starts on the 20th of October. More likely they get shipped in December, but the earliest arrival would be January. Indonesian material becomes available, and that could be at destination in Vietnam by December. But in 2023, so far, there's only been 4,860 tons imported from Indonesia. So the product is being consumed in Indonesia or is going to India. And the Mozambique crop comes online very soon, but that probably won't get shipped until January, earliest ETA February. So you need a certain amount of inventory because monthly imports fall at the latter part of the year. And you can see that the trend in imports in Vietnam every year, 2017 through to 2022, always the end of the year, September, October, November, December, imports tend to fall. And interestingly, the higher the peak in the early part of the year, the deeper the fall in the last part of the year. And that's perfectly logical. There's a limit to the amount you need. The more you take in early, the less you buy later. And this year, well, it's a very high peak up in July, August. So we might expect imports to fall. But on the other hand, exports of kernels tend to stay steady. So exports of kernels after the quiet early period, during the festivals in Vietnam, you don't get much processing, so exports are low. It's relatively steady throughout the year, month on month. So in the last quarter, whereas imports will fall, exports more than likely will remain fairly steady. Now, just to remind you that what's in transit stock is not included in these numbers, because that's guessing, and I don't like to guess. But is 2.25 months stock too much? Probably not. Not at this time of year. If this was March, I'd be very concerned, but it's not March, it's October. So unless we see very large imports from African countries or from Indonesia or from Tanzania in the coming weeks, I think Vietnam probably doesn't have a major problem. Add to that raw cashew nut prices have fallen and they're at relatively low levels. What does that mean? Well, let's have a look at raw cashew nut prices in Vietnam. So here we have the monthly average raw cashew nut import price during 2023. And you can see what's happened. Two things. Firstly, the market has fallen in the course of the year, bringing the average price down as the year has gone on. Now, there's also a qualifying factor. The raw nuts that were purchased in this period, February, March, April, are not the same quality as the raw nuts that were purchased later on. So quality falls too, outturn falls. High quality Cambodian raw nuts are the backbone of imports during February, March, April, but lesser outturn material, 48, 46, comes at the latter part of the year, and naturally prices will fall. So let's have a look and see, what does that fall in the average import price of raw cashew nuts, what might that mean in terms of the profitability or the average cost for Vietnamese processors? So here's a chart. Let me explain this one carefully. So this axis is US dollars per pound FOB. And this is cost and freight price for raw cashew nuts, actual imported price in Vietnam. So we're going to take this for imported raw cashew nuts. We have the average cost. So I'm using all-in costs of about $200 a ton to process in Vietnam. And I'm using an outturn starting at 52, falling to 50, and eventually coming down toward 46. So the blue bars represent the average cost per pound. This is for all grades. Average cost per pound to produce them. And the orange is the benchmark grade, the 320s. And so what we see, and this is a very general comparison, what we see is that the cost in blue exceeded the 320 price in the early part of the year. As the year has gone on, that situation has turned around. Not because kernels prices have gone up, but because raw cashew nut prices have fallen. It doesn't mean that Vietnamese processors are in good shape. It just means that the situation has improved. This relationship now does not mean that processors are making a profit. In fact, there isn't really room in there to make a profit for an average processor, unless someone who has their costs at extremely low levels. So yes, the position has improved, but not enough to make this relationship as it stands between kernels prices and raw cashew nuts sustainable. So the problem still persists. The average cost of raw material doesn't allow a processor to make a profit in Vietnam, and it's even quite difficult in India. So let's have a look at the Indian situation. So here we are in India, and again we got 3 years, 2021 in blue, 2022 in orange, 2023 the grey columns. So we have an estimate of the domestic usage expressed in raw cashew nut terms. We have export, again in raw cashew nut terms. Imports, the full year 2021, full year 2022, and the situation to August 2023. I think that's 867,000 tons imported until August. The crop in Vietnam, I put a figure of 750,000 tons there. I'm open to discussion on that. The opening stock this year, very high. We know that because we know that the imports last year were in the region of 1.4 million tons. I do an estimate of a typical closing stock. So what you should have available for processing January, February in the low season for supply. And then we do the calculation, which based on the current factors, last year was very high. This year is on the current import. So if they stopped importing now and didn't import anything till the end of the year, the closing stock would probably be too low. So assuming that domestic demand remains steady, and assuming that exports, which are at the moment up a little, up about 2%, but assuming that exports hit the same number as last year, that would mean by my calculations that India needs about 150,000 tons additional import, mostly to carry into 2024. That would put total imports for the year just over 1 million tons. A really good figure. It looks, compared to last year, it doesn't look particularly positive, but compared to any other year, maybe bar one, this looks like a really good level of imports. So the Indian demand situation tends to suggest that although we're not going to see aggressive buying by India, that there is a little bit more needed and that there isn't likely to be an oversupply at the end of the year, except if buyers for some reason chase new crop East African or balances in West Africa during the rest of the year. And they may do that because they may want particular quality material. So that's Vietnam and India's situation on supply. Indications that perhaps this might be a turning point in the market. Let's have a quick look at production. As I've said, Brazil, the estimate from the IBGE is 127,000 tons, down about 14% on last year. But what is really a normal crop these days? Mozambique, IAM gave me some figures, which I'm grateful to them for. They're estimating that production in the region of 160,000 tons, and the reference price has been set at 35 Medakai, about 5% down on last year. The logic being that the international market has changed. That makes sense. In Tanzania, good performance on inputs. The weather's been okay. Could we be looking at a return to a crop in the region of 300,000 tons? The record is, I believe, 313,000 tons. Early distribution of inputs could mean that this has worked out well this year and we could see a good crop in Tanzania. Figures of 400,000 tons have been mentioned, but it seems to me unlikely this year, though that will probably happen in the future. Overall situation is that between the three, an additional 100,000 tons comes to market. Now, in a production of 4.7, 4.6 million tons, an additional 100,000 tons is not a big deal, but in a position where at this time of year, we're looking at somewhere in the region of 500,000 tons, and this additional 100,000 tons is a big deal. And that's dependent really on Mozambique living up to the IAM forecast. And so next time, in 2 weeks, on the 18th of October, we're hoping to have the Cashew Institute of Mozambique and the Cashew Board of Tanzania as guests here on the GME to talk to us about the prospects for the upcoming season in those two countries. And we're looking forward to that. So again, in production, nothing that would make us think that the surplus is being added to, nothing that would make us think that the supply-demand balance is likely to be upset by Southern Hemisphere crops. We said we'd talk about risk, and there is one big risk factor in play at the moment, and that is the impact of El Nino. El Nino is a weather phenomenon. I'll leave you to, if you're not aware of it, I'll leave you to research that yourself and just give you a quick explanation of what we're seeing. And this, again, atmospheric administration of the United States to explain what's going on. So you can see the key at the bottom. So first of all, El Nino climate impacts December to February. Why is December to February interesting to us? Well, it's flowering season, particularly Cambodia, Vietnam. And down at the bottom, you see the key. So I draw your attention to warm and dry. So December to February, warm and dry in Southeast Asia. Dry in Northeast Brazil. These are all major potential impacts. And later, in the June-August position, over India, we see dry. So you could see an impact on the monsoon in India in 2024. Impacts possible on cashews, and these are possible. It is a very strong El Nino, but these are possible impacts. We have to follow this story closely. You could get very hot, very dry weather during flowering in Cambodia and Vietnam. That could damage flowers. It is possible. And we have seen that the new varieties in Cambodia particularly are vulnerable to unseasonal weather. It's possible that Brazil experiences an overly dry period in December to February that may not have a huge impact on this crop, but it may have an impact on the next crop. We'll have to wait and see. And there is a possibility that the Indian monsoon in 2024 could be impacted. And that would have an impact on supply, potentially, but it would also have an impact on demand, the monsoon being so important to the Indian economy. And that could impact demand and consumption of cashew nuts in 2024. So a number of risk factors here, none of them confirmed, but all of them possible impacts. And I do recall going back to 1997, when there was another strong El Nino, that we did have an impact on crops. And 1998 was a year when prices went pretty high for the times based on a lack of supply. We didn't understand El Nino to the same extent then, but this needs to be watched closely. So let's have a look at the outlook. Let's start with the raw cashew nuts. And let's see if we can answer this question. These buyers to buy cashew nuts right now, but they will need to keep going and they will need to keep buying to meet their export demand. India may need additional raw cashew nuts, but not in any big volumes. There's no real suggestion that you will have any kind of a squeeze in raw cashew nuts at the end of the year. West African closing stocks may turn out to be lower than might have been earlier expected. Shipments have been better. Imports in Vietnam have been well up. Imports in India down, but still at 867,000 tons plus, pretty healthy. So that might mean that the early demand in the Tanzanian auction is likely to be slow and prices likely to be low. There will be difficult decisions to be made. We could see a situation where patience is needed and prices may not meet some of the early expectations. Looking at the values of raw cashew nuts based on average import prices and the current market, it looks like the calculation for processors has improved, but that it's still pretty difficult. This is certainly not a time of plenty for processors in Vietnam or indeed elsewhere. Looking at raw cashew nuts, it seems to me that there. So is it a turning point? Looking at raw cashew nuts, you would probably say neutral, maybe neutral to no, not right now. But let's look at kernels and see if we see something a little bit different. Is this a turning point in the cashew kernels market? Let's see what we find. So I'm going to look at it in terms of markets, first of all. So we see prices are up. We say that there is more forward buying, and we see that sellers have backed off a little bit. There are fewer sellers, fewer resellers, and fewer origin sellers. Let's look at trade. So by this we mean the movement of cashew kernels around the world. Imports are up in the Western markets, certainly compared to earlier this year, certainly compared to the second half of last year. Indian demand is strong. Indian demand is the crucial market. Don't forget, Indian demand from an international point of view is seen for RCN, because India doesn't import any major quantities of cashew kernels. Vietnamese exports are at record levels, and that's now becoming across a wide range of markets, not just as we saw earlier in the year to markets in Asia and the Middle East. It's now also US and European markets. What are the signals we're seeing in the market? So we talk about signals that might give us an indication of where prices are going and whether or not this is a turning point. We've talked about the price gap between the lowest price seller and the highest price seller has got wider. We know that buyers are concerned about the prospect of defaults. We know that they're talking about how to manage that if and when it happens. And that's a clear signal of their expectations. We know that the relationship between raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices has got better. Not good enough for profitability, but better than it was. Again, an indication. And we know that some promotions are taking place of cashew kernels, particularly beginning in Western countries, and that in some countries, retail prices now are beginning to reflect the lower wholesale prices. For a long time, retail prices did not reflect the lower raw material prices for reasons of other costs. And if we look at the supply situation, it looks like 2023.
Hello, James. If you can hear me, can you pause for a moment? Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Blessing.
I think we are back on track. You may continue. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure at what point you lost me, but let me back up and talk about some of these factors. So we're answering this question: is this the turning point in the market? Particularly focused on kernels at this point. And we looked at factors in the market. We looked at trade.
Jim, I'm afraid you may have to pause again.
I guess we've got some form of technical problem. So I'll just continue talking for those who can hear me rather than leave silence. We've been talking about markets, trade, signals, and we're talking about supply. If we look at these factors, we're seeing a situation where, in general, the 2023 crop has been quite well managed. We're looking at a situation where there are certain signals in the market that would make us believe that this could be a turning point in terms of demand, and therefore in the longer term, perhaps in terms of kernels prices. And we're looking at a situation where right now, the real opportunity for almost all players in this market is on the upside. We're at low prices, we're at historically low prices, and therefore the opportunity is on the upside. So most people will benefit by rising prices. That would exclude consumers at the end, but what they're seeing is falling prices. So what we're seeing is the two coming together. There is a risk of damage to the next crop by El Nino, and that would change the scenario dramatically. But that's not now, and on what we know, we could say, yes, perhaps it is a turning point, but it will take time. This is not going to be a rocket into the sky like we've seen in the past. This will move slowly upwards, and we will see, I think, an improvement in demand and probably in prices as time goes on. But I'm talking kernels, I'm not talking RCN. But this is complicated. And there's more at play than just the cashew market when we look at this. So we need to think about the factors that might frustrate this turn in the market. The raw cashew nut stock in Vietnam, how much is there? What quality is it? Is it in strong hands or is it in weak hands? Poor market information generally can frustrate logical market movements. So it may be that there are factors that we don't know. There may be factors that we don't know we don't know. It's also likely that buyers will continue to be reluctant. In making a move in the market because simply they've become accustomed to lower prices. They've become accustomed to a situation where the longer they wait, the more they're rewarded. On the other side of that, there is a risk of default. If the market moves up 10, 15, 20 cents a pound, there will always be some contract default, and that tends to add fuel to the fire, even if that fire is only simmering rather than burning brightly. And of course, we've still got the prospect of rising costs. And when we look at the situation and we look at economies, and we look at the economies in Europe, economies in China, we look at energy prices, and we look at the supply of other tree nuts and their prices, there may be enough there. I don't think to stop this being a turning point, but I do think to make sure that that turn back toward a more normal pattern of demand and more logical prices that work for farmers and processors and buyers, I think that might take time. So I think, yes, it is a turning point, but don't expect any huge developments in the short term. So thanks very much for your time today. We've concentrated on the market because we've been away with the conference. We've been away for the last 4 weeks, and I thought it was time to get back and have a good look at the market. And we've also seen, for the first time in a while, we've seen some interesting developments in the market, and I wanted to try and discuss those and explain them. So let's see if there are any questions, and I'll pass you back to Blessing. Any questions, Blessing?
Thank you very much, Jim. Yes, there are. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a few questions here, and the first one is, What are the realistic, practical ways to increase consumption in Africa, in your opinion?
Well, I think that, first of all, to build and educate on the benefits of cashew kernels, on the benefits of consuming them, of the fact that this is a product that is nutritious and tastes great. Secondly, I think that maybe adjusting the type of products that are available to consumers in African countries so that it fits better with styles, habits, traditions of consumption of food products in African countries. You know, in the West, which has driven the consumption of cashews from the beginning, it was always as a snack food. And whilst that fits and is increasing in African countries, we may need to be looking at other kinds of products. I think pricing is also important. So I think you need to consider, when you start to market in any market, the affordability of the product and how the product fits with consumers' incomes and their spending patterns. But for me, the primary thing would be to start with that building of awareness and educating consumers of the opportunities. And secondly, I think that it's also important that the products that are available are really good. Good quality, well-packed, well-presented products are essential, whatever market you go into. The idea that in the past has been promoted that somehow African consumers will settle for something less, this is not a good way to market. It needs to be good products to consumers who know what's being offered and know how that product can benefit them. Blessing.
Thank you, Jim. And the next question is, with the season in West Africa completed, what should be done differently? What should farmers, processors, and buyers do differently? What role should the government play starting now in preparation for the next season? Thank you.
Wow, that's not an easy question. What part should governments play? Well, I think governments should play the part of basing their strategy, basing their marketing on realities of the market. If we look at how is data gathered, how is data analyzed, what do the market trends mean, I think it's essential that governments look at that. I mean, it's very well to consider cashews as an opportunity in political expediency. That's fine. But when it comes down to it, we do need to look at the market and base policy and base strategy and base support on the realities of the market. I think that the farmers, processors and buyers, well, farmers do a pretty good job. They have been increasing their production. You'd like to see better yields and higher quality. I think if I were talking to farmers, if I could do that, I'd be saying, get as organized as you possibly can and build as many linkages as you can to processors. And on the flip side of that, I'd say to processors, organize your supply chain, link to farmers, help them organize if they're not already organized, and work with them for the long term. So I think farmers always tend to believe in the long term, otherwise they wouldn't plant trees. But they also need to be encouraged to understand that the long-term best opportunity is in the development of processing. For buyers, I presume when you mention buyers, you mean the buyers of raw cashew nuts. Reward quality. If a good quality product is offered, reward it. Don't just look for the least common denominator. That's a really complex, it's a great question actually. It's a really complex question. And it's something that perhaps we should come back to in one of the sessions building up to the new season in West Africa. Back to you, Blessing. Okay, looks like we may have lost Blessing, but I see a question in the chat. Let me read this question. It's a pretty good one. Are we actually looking at an oversupply situation in India? Or are we seeing a shift in production from traditional to non-traditional areas? And that's obviously a question from someone who knows what they're talking about when it comes to cashews in India. So I think that we are not really looking at an oversupply situation in India. I mean, that may be short-term to long-term. I think what we are seeing and have been seeing for some time is that shift in production. I think there's also a shift in processing. So I think it's true, we have seen a shift in production. If we want to talk about it north and east, so away from the traditional centers, but that's also been an increase in production. Processing, it seems to me, has tended to move closer to markets, so closer to the big cities in North India, and that those processing plants in Gujarat, for example, those processing plants are based primarily on imported raw nuts, and therefore you get two different situations that emerge. You get the long-term processors in the growing areas in India that supplement their local raw material supply with imports, and you get another group of processors, generally quite young businesses, quite modern, tend to be more mechanized. Those businesses are running primarily on imported raw material, and their advantage is their modern business, their management, but also the fact that they're located close to market. So yeah, we are seeing big changes in India. I think that that also has knock-on effects for Africa, to understand the difference between buyers, the difference between quality needs of those buyers, and the difference in aiming products at specific buyers. It's always important to understand your market. I think Blessing is back with us. Can you hear me, Blessing?
Yes, I can hear you, Jim.
Okay, I just answered the third question there on the list whilst we couldn't hear you. So are there any further questions?
Yes, I do have a question here, actually, too. You mentioned there will be guests from the Cashew Nut Board of Tanzania and the Institute of Nuts Mozambique. Could you give an overview what will be discussed in the next GNE?
So we're hoping to have those guests from those two organizations, and we'll be asking them to give us a profile on the situation in Mozambique and in Tanzania, the outlook for the upcoming crops, and maybe an explanation of some of the interesting changes that have taken place over the last 12 months in terms of how the sector is organized in those countries. There should be some interesting feedback. There's a conference in Tanzania next week, and in Mozambique they've just completed the discussion on reference pricing, and that news will be quite interesting in terms of where those two countries go. They are really important, obviously, at this time of year, because the bulk of cashew nuts grown in the opposite season, let's say the October to December season, are grown in those two countries. So I'm really looking forward to listening to their contribution the next time round, and maybe asking a few interesting questions too. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And just before we move on to the next session, what should we look out for within the next 2 weeks before the session where we'll be having this guest? What are the things that you think we should look out for in the market?
I think it's important to look out for further activity on kernels, particularly if you see more forward buying. Keep an eye out for that. That would be expressed by the forward prices rising a little bit further. I think you would also be well advised to keep an eye on the raw cashew nut trade situation, on if raw cashew nut is trading, what prices it's trading at. I think that would be interesting. And if you have the opportunity, although not everyone does, keep an eye on what's happening in terms of promotions of kernels. Watch what happens, particularly in the US market and also in the Chinese market. There's a lot to watch at this time of year. If we are at a turning point, if I'm right in that, we'll know within the next 4 or 5 weeks. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. That'll be all the questions. Probably concluding words from you before we close the session.
Well, let me just thank everyone for joining us again. It's really a great opportunity to talk about the markets, and I'd encourage people that when they join to ask questions and offer contributions. I'm available if you want to talk cashews. My email address is on the screen. You can contact me on WhatsApp. You can join the Cashew Club on LinkedIn, or you can talk via the African Cashew Alliance. Always good to hear from anyone who wants to talk about cashews. Thanks very much. Take care. Look forward to the next time. All the best for now.
Thank you very much, Jim, for another session. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of another session of the ACO Global Marketing Council with Jim Fitzpatrick. And on behalf of the African Cashew Alliance, we appreciate every partner and sponsor who made it possible for us to bring these sessions to you. And as Jim mentioned, join us again next 2 weeks on the 18th of October, where we'll be having two guests from Tanzania and Mozambique. Until then, do take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.
Okay. Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials.